So I'll put your clicker here. Yes, lovely, excellent.
And then should I use this
It
one?
should pick it up from here. This is for Q&A.
Okay, how close do I need to be?
Hello,
I've got a bit
hello,
of soft
hello.
voice, so
Maybe this is better.
I think I will use this just to push it.
So you just have to be 45 degrees. Really? I will start with my introduction. Anyway, I will have just introduced you with a little piece of paper. Right. Yeah. Welcome everybody. We will start briefly. Please take your seats, please. Well, welcome everybody. This nice, crispy, cold morning. My name is Sohail Shahryar. I'm the chairman of United Nations Association Harpenden. For those who don't know about us, we are a grassroots community group associated with UNA UK, which is based in Whitehall. They have connections with Westminster, and through them we have access to MPs and other influencers of the UN. But locally in Harpenden, we have been here since 1945. We have about 200 members covering Harpenden, St Albans, Wheat Hampstead, Redbourne. Our speaker is from Redbourne. We have a website, we have a newsletter. There's no membership fee, joining is free, everybody is welcome. We have regular meetings like this once a month. Our next meeting is in February 18th. Will be from Professor Linda Yu from London Business School, talking about the great economists. That'll be an interesting one. As I said, we have no membership fee, but we'd be grateful for any donations, either credit card or cash, that pays for our expenses. The format of the talk today is half an hour presentation by slide, etc., half an hour Q&A, and then refreshments, coffee next door for another hour or so. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the speaker. I left my introductory notes, but I will say welcome to Professor Jennifer Jackson-Preece. She is an associate professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She has written many books. I'm trying to remember from memory here. And she is very well acknowledged in the academic circles. So please welcome Professor Jennifer Jackson-Preece.
Thank you very much, Suyan. And thank you everybody for coming on what I realize is a bit of a cold and slippery day. I must say I was delighted to get the invitation. I lived in Redbourne for 20 years, and I was wholly ignorant of the UN Society, so it was nice to discover it. And I was particularly delighted to find that you, in fact, trace your roots all the way back to the League, which pleases me because I am one of these unusual people who is a League aficionado. I've actually written on the League. We do have a secret handshake, which I can introduce you to later. But to take advantage of this moment, I thought I would style my talk looking actually back to the League a little bit before, since you are a World League Association, and then talking forward through what the United Nations has done as a part of its existing human rights regime, which is directed specifically at minorities. Academics are notorious. You give them a minute, they speak for an hour, but I'm going to keep my eye on the clock, and I look forward to talking about this more over coffee and, of course, in our Q&A. So to begin with then, the three key points that I would like to go over today are first to introduce you to the problem of minorities. In other words, why is this issue that arises in the context of today's human rights regime, what are its origins historically, and how, this leads me on to my second point, how have we progressed from earlier conceptions of guarantees to the current framing of rights. I'm then going to talk you through some of the problems that arise in this context, and also the future trajectory of where discussion at the UN and indeed in other international organizations that deal with minority questions seems to be going, in order to try and address some of the shortcomings we have at present. Just to give you a little bit of an insight in terms of what it is that you're thinking of when we think of the idea, the concept of minority rights. In effect, minorities are those groups who are political outsiders. At any moment in time, their outsideness would be associated with the way in which they are problematically situated in the prevailing conception of the political community. And the precise definition of them has changed over historical time, and I'll talk through that in a moment. But the most important point is that they are identified as, in some ways, not fully belonging, or even more problematically, challenging the existing basis for political community. And so this opens up a whole series of questions. We have the obvious predicament of problems to do with discrimination, of marginalization, of communities that are not able to fully partake within society, within politics, within economics. We of course have specific policies directed at such groups, which may be intended to limit their ability to engage purposefully, because this is regarded as a possible challenge to the sovereignty and the territory of existing states. This can, of course, lead on to issues around conflict. It can precipitate at the extreme, of course, ethnic cleansing and genocide. And indeed, you can think of any number of issues at the present time where these sorts of dynamics are at play. You can think, of course, of events that we've seen in Kosovo in the past couple of decades, where we indeed have precisely the movements of peoples triggered by discrimination rising to oppression. You can think of the Rohingya moving out of Myanmar today. You can think of the Uyghurs in China. And indeed, of course, you can think of Ukraine, because there we have the return of an idea of identity, that is, of course, a claim for conquest based on the presumption of an affinity with a particular group in a particular territory, and what we refer to as a kin state, making claims for redrawing the boundaries on that basis. An important figure to bear in mind as we talk about all of this: the majority of the world's internally displaced persons and refugees are in fact minorities. They're minorities in their country of origin, and of course they also are minorities in their country of destination. So the impact on all of this is considerable. When we look back at the broad history, and I will move fairly quickly through this because I want to take you to today and the controversies more than the past, but simply to draw to your attention that that sense of a dilemma around questions of identity and belonging linked to sovereignty and statehood is an old one. We can go all the way back to the beginning of the modern state system, which IR scholars such as myself like to conveniently date from the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century. And moving forward from that time, you have an ongoing history of international treaties which are addressed at problems of anomalous groups, as they were understood, whereby you had a group in the territory of one sovereign that had affinities with the population in the territory of another sovereign, and so treaties were made between the two sovereigns, guaranteeing the rights of these communities in an effort to avoid future conflict. It's all really a conflict prevention modus operandi and non-human rights modus operandi. And the language of guarantees is significant because a guarantee, of course, comes from the sovereign and therefore can be given up at the discretion of the sovereign, abridged at the discretion of the sovereign, limited at the discretion of the sovereign. And when, of course, today we talk about human rights as being held by individual human beings, it's an effort to make that more difficult. In other words, to prevent against those occasions where a sovereign might decide these really convenient for whatever political reasons and choose to transgress them, of course they still do, but we cannot at least deny it as a principle of being a right that these groups should be able to possess. So in the beginning, it was all about religion, because that was the basis for political community. As we get into the 18th and 19th century, the focal point of the groups who do not belong changes, just as the idea of political community itself changes. It begins to be focused much more on questions having to do with ethno-cultural identity, nationalism is emerging, particularly in Europe at this time. And so at this point, we see the creation of nation states, the springtime of nations in the 19th century and into the 20th in Europe. And throughout that period, again, we have a long history of the recognition of guarantees for anomalous communities created as a result of the changes in boundaries between states. Kevin is here. I'm sure he can talk a lot about what happened in the creation of the Greek state, where we also had issues of this kind. Indeed, the ending of the Ottoman Empire in Europe triggered a whole series of these. And indeed, the 1878 Congress of Berlin, which was intended to sort out changes in the map in the broader area of the Balkans, also was much concerned with issues of minorities, and in fact stood as a precedent for what was decided in 1918. By the time we hit the League, we have, of course, moved into the era of self-determination. And this is Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points, where the understanding was that sovereignty would be based on the principle of national self-determination, which would be the basis for representative governments to form, democracies in other words, and picking up that liberal, its origins Kantian belief that democracy did not wage war against one another. The presumption was that peoples so empowered would not go to war again, and the creation of the League, of course, is an international organization to resolve peacefully disputes that might arise. All of this intended to prevent the return of war to the extent that had been experienced, of course, the horrors of the First World War. We know the benefit of hindsight, it didn't work, but at the time there was an interesting experiment around the recognition of minority rights and placing that guarantee, still in the language of the guarantee, for the first time under the remit of an international organization. This was a limited arrangement, and indeed, if you look back at the paperwork from the Paris Peace Conference, guilty, and again, I can answer questions if you're interested in any of this, you will see that Woodrow Wilson's idea of national self-determination was never a universal one. He intended it only to apply in defeated territories of those combatants within Europe. So this was never meant to be a principle. It could not be, of course, because at that time, decolonization was not on the agenda. Race was never recognized. It was actually proposed to be included in the League Covenant by the Japanese, and it was rejected. And the conversation that we had was largely driven forward, for instance, by Australia, that had one Australian policy at that time. Also, the recognition by the Americans that it would never pass through Congress, because, of course, they still had the problem of Jim Crow in the South. So that was never an issue either. But what we did have was the recognition of particular rights for specific communities as part of the peace treaties that ended the war, and also as part of the conditionality, the form of conditionality for membership within the League. In particular, there was a focus on Jewish communities throughout Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed, we can locate the progressive diminution of their rights, that is, progressive failure of states to comply, and indeed the progressive unwillingness of great powers to push for their compliance as part and parcel of the movement back to war, which of course culminated in the Second World War, and we know how that played out in terms of problems of minorities. After 1945, in the context of the creation of the United Nations, the League, I think unfairly, was judged to be a failure and was blamed in part for the return of war. And so there was a determination not to repeat what was seen to be the failures of the League, and the system of minority guarantees was part of that. And it was even more understood to be potentially problematic because, of course, in 1945, decolonization was firmly on the agenda. And if Central and Eastern Europe was ethnoculturally diverse, well, that was nothing compared to the level of diversity that you would find within the successor states, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa. So there was a shift away from the Wilsonian idea of national self-determination. It nowhere appears in the Charter of the UN. Instead, there is a convenient shift in semantics to a people's right to self-determination, with people defined according to pre-existing juridical boundaries. In other words, what we had, of course, is the idea that colonies could become internationalized as independent states, but there would be no redrawing boundaries around that transfer. The old boundaries of the empire, its internal boundaries, would remain. So Kenya colony became the independent state of Kenya. Linked to that was a desire not to want to recognize these subnational groups out of the fear that it would push secession and irredentism in what would be the newly decolonized world. So instead, we had the switch to the idea of human rights, which recognizes individuals, not groups. And through that, it was about another 20 years before we actually got to the recognition again, specifically of an idea of rights, this time of persons belonging to minorities. So again, this is an individual rights regime, and it is understood to be a part of the human rights system and not something separate on its own. The first kind of big, I missed something. Yes, no, I've said all that. The first kind of interesting statement that you have around thinking of this in terms of its actual outcomes of protection is an interesting UN High Commissioner on Human Rights comment, which says quite clearly that minorities do have rights, and equally, if you look back at the OSCE Article 27, which was the key, it talked about a right to existence, and in this particular commentary, you have a sense in which the degree of permanence that existence requires should be understood in a more flexible way. So states wanted to set this at quite a long durée, but at this point there is an intention to open scope for it, and equally to decouple existence from an idea of citizenship, so that it would apply equally to those groups who are not recognized as citizens, which becomes important, of course, in the context of minorities, where frequently the denial of citizenship is, of course, part of the politics of non-belonging that we see. We think, of course, of the problems of the Palestinians who have existed now intergenerationally and not been recognized as citizens. When we look to what has happened at the UN, we see, therefore, within the human rights regime, on that part of it, it is focused on ideas of distinct identity and existence for identity-based groups, a division, so that we can talk of the rights of minorities, we can talk of the rights of indigenous peoples, and we can also talk of the rights of what are now referred to as Afro-descendants. These, of course, the descendants of those who were taken from Africa across the Atlantic as part of the slave trade. And each of these categories has somewhat different rights and somewhat different claims. Interestingly, the only groups who are understood to have a right of self-determination and whose rights have a specifically collective framing are indigenous peoples, and that puts them in the special category. And that is done because they are understood to be part of the problem of colonization and therefore benefit from what was decided in terms of the move towards decolonization. And early on, they identified themselves with that movement. So effectively, the problem of indigenous peoples is understood as a problem of internal colonialism. Just as there was colonialism in the British Empire, so too is there a form of internal colonialism, for instance, Canada, where I come from, and in fact, those indigenous communities being run as internal colonies actually using very similar administrative methods as you would have had in the colonial office in London. So again, different categories of rights. The big statement on minority rights at the UN is now 30 years old. It was the UN Minorities Declaration. It identifies minorities by the inclusion of particular adjectives. This is rights of persons belonging to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic groups. Interestingly, again, you will see race is not present there. And the reason for that is because race is understood to have a separate rights foundation. Of course, of the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination, Racial Discrimination at the UN. And again, all of those questions would be dealt with under a separate rights rubric. The fact that it is only identified by adjectives, this definition of minority, is also significant. There is actually no universal definition of a minority. The states have never been able to agree. Why have they not been able to agree? They have not been able to agree because, of course, if there was a single definition, it could be used against them. In other words, it curtails their sovereignty. So they refuse to give up the right to decide who is and who is not a minority in their own territory. And again, that is part and parcel of politics, belonging and non-belonging. It's a problem everywhere in the context of minority rights. If we look, for instance, in Europe, famously, the first High Commissioner on National Minorities, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, overcame the problem by saying, I know a minority when I see one. And that was it. So you can't really argue with that. So again, the ways in which this comes together remind us of the problem and the depth of the problem. We cannot even get agreement on the basic scope of meaning of the word. Again, if you look at the content of the rights, all of this fundamentally about problem with minorities, these are guarantees, of course, once more for equality, protection against non-discrimination, but also the preservation of those qualities which form the distinctiveness of the group, the ability of the group to be able to perpetuate itself, which is necessary, of course, for its continued existence. That has to do with the recognition of its distinctiveness by the state, but equally, balancing that against the principle of equality means that that group should be also included within the state, that we should have integration, distinct from assimilation. Assimilation, of course, is a unidirectional process set by the state, where those who are different become similar to the majority. Integration is understood differently as a two-way process in which everybody within the state, minorities and majorities, adjust to accommodate one another, and therefore it has a mutual accommodation within it, and that everybody changes, and that everybody changes dynamic is intended to be based, of course, on the idea of mutual respect for rights. In theory, in practice, it tends to break down, but that at least is the goal. How does all of this get enforced? The UN Declaration is precisely that. It is a declaration, meaning a declaratory statement of the intent. It is not a legally binding treaty. And you can characterize that against indigenous rights, which are based on treaties. So they are much more legal weight within international relations and international law because of that. So we're talking about good ideas, the desire to do better, and again, the kinds of enforcement that follow on from that are, of course, the weakest kind of enforcement that we have. It is, in effect, the moral approbation of international public opinion, the desire, in other words, for states to devote care about the ways in which they are regarded. It happens through discussions at the UN in particular fora. There is the Special Rapporteur on minority issues that exists to regularly write reports on how well states are doing in their implementations and to discuss these within auspices of the UN. There is also something called Forum on Minority Issues, which is intended to open space for minorities themselves, to the NGOs that represent them, to come forward to Geneva, where it is annually in December, and be able to engage directly with the rapporteur, and also with delegations from member states, and they're also present there, again, to increase the attention paid to these issues, and hopefully, this is just a hope, hopefully provide a platform for minorities to be able to articulate what they regard as their necessary rights in this situation, linked to that notion that they do have a right to exist, to be different, and to be included on an equal basis while respecting their differences. Does it work? Well, that's the million-dollar question. Unfortunately, not very well. Not surprisingly, of course, because it is purely a declaratory statement, and it doesn't have as much force that it would acquire if it indeed had at least some sort of treaty status. There are a lot of challenges in this, and they have always been historically, precisely because we are ultimately talking about sovereignty, and states jealously guard their sovereignty. It is the basis of their right to existence, and sovereignty, of course, involves effective control over territories and populations within them. That means, of course, that the legitimacy of the state, sovereignty, the government, rests on that sense of affinity in some way, at least with the population within them, and so too does their arguments for claiming the territory and defending their territory. So all of this really raises stakes when it comes to talking about minority questions. Today, the main challenges that arise in this context are, for instance, populism, where we have, of course, a growing emphasis on the privileging of a particular identity, negative sentiments of politics, and again, that magnifies the tension around belonging and non-belonging. You see this, of course, as a generalizable problem. You can look at it, for instance, in Hungary with Viktor Orban, and what's happened with the Roma there, indeed the Roma across Europe, of course, the most marginalized community in Europe, and they have suffered a big lift from this. And indeed, if we look at what happened in the COVID pandemic, again, it's magnified. Populism, of course, fed off of that, or the use of it as an excuse to increase its control, to rule without review from Parliament or judicial review, and again, minorities do pay a price for that. There is also the tension between minorities and developments, of course, in the developing world, where ideas of protection for minorities are seen to limit the ability of the state to push towards economic development, preserving traditional areas for minorities, traditional occupations, may stand in the way of big extractive developments, for instance, and again, that creates a tension. Once we get to the point where there is a strong understanding of competing interests within the territorial security related issues, and again, this is a very big problem, and that's the point that we start moving towards the worst human rights violations that we can think of. It's pushed towards conflict, ethnic conflict, civil war. We see ethnic cleansing, we see genocide, we see mass migration flows across frontiers. So all of these problems remain. When we look at the rights themselves, again, there is difficulty because the global dimension of this, which the declaratory statement, is very thin. Instead, if you want to have greater depth, you need to go regionally, and you will see significant regional differences. So Europe, for instance, is the global focal point for minority rights. We do have a convention linked to the Council of Europe, Framework Convention for Protection of National Minorities. We also have a conflict prevention instrument linked to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and ongoing guidelines and dialogue with states in Europe and indeed from Vancouver to Vladivostok to the OSCE on all of that. In comparison, in the Americas, we have a similar dynamic, for instance, for digital sites. Again, so there are these little variations. You have in other places where this hasn't gone anywhere at all. You can think, for instance, of sub-Saharan Africa, where we do not have a push in this direction. And again, if we look to the Banjul Charter on African human and people's rights, there's a reason for that, because self-determination in Africa is understood as a one-off moment, transferring power from empires to post-colonial successive states, and removing any legitimacy of subsequent claims on the basis of the state movements. Again, that has been the understanding in Africa in order to prevent conflict, to preserve the map in the way that it was inherited. But the outcome of that, of course, has been an absence of right thinking. And again, you can see all kinds of issues related to minorities playing out in Africa. And obviously, problems in Rwanda, where we have genocide, we have ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is involving, in fact, different minority groups. You can think of Biafra. It's an interesting case from the UN. So it's not like there is no minority questions there, but we are not handling the minority questions. And again, that's a limitation. Equally, we have a tension between what are called new and old minorities. This gets back again thinking about existence, what does it mean to exist, to decide how long do you have to be in existence in a particular place in order to be recognized. States, remember, define minorities in their terms. Hungary is a great rule. It has a 100-year rule set in, what was the year? 1990, no, later than that. From the year roughly 2000, effectively the 100-year rule puts the clock back to the moment where Hungary, under the Trianon peace treaty, became independent from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if you show that you were back then, great, you're a national minority. If you can't, you're not. So the 100-year rule set very, very high. Other states look at this differently. In the United Kingdom, for instance, the minorities find their solution to that, meaning that all of the post-migrant communities in the UK are also recognized as minorities. Not everybody is happy with this. The Cornish, for instance, are deeply disgruntled because they are not a devolved nation. They are then standing as a minority, which they feel is not sufficient to recognize the link of their jure as a separate community in the United Kingdom. So again, however you do this, there are winners and losers, and all of it is controversial. There is also a big problem around advocacy versus sub-alternative. Because minorities tend to be championed by experts, this is true, by NGOs, and filled with experts, there is always a problem of speaking for minorities rather than having minorities for themselves. And that's a big tension. And there are efforts to try and encourage minorities to come forward, to form their own organizations, to be representative and be represented directly by and through their own chosen delegates, but it is difficult. Again, it's difficult in part because of all of the deeper legacy of marginalization. So bringing people forward, creating trust, how that happen is not something easily achieved. Which brings us back to perhaps the biggest problem of all, which is the possession paradox. This applies to all human rights. It is so styled by an academic called Jackson-Preece, and it gets an awful lot of play, certainly in literature. Basically, it says the following: it's all well and good to point to the document that says you have a right, but unless you actually possess the right to use it, gets, for instance, the state, can you really say you have it at all? No, clearly it's not doing what it's intended to do. It's a legal fiction, in other words, which says then, if you follow the line of thought, that minority rights, including the Minorities Declaration, is something that really will address it. It makes states look pretty, makes the UN look like it's doing something, but in reality, perhaps it's not really doing much of anything at all. How do we move beyond it? Moving beyond it really requires active participation by minorities, and if they are truly engaged, then they will be putting forward their own interests, and there will be space because they are participating for them to do that, which means that the state will somehow have created or accepted that space for them. And this is where the focus point now is. And it's really also wanting to learn from the past time, because we've struggled with this as well. And again, unless you have that sense of empowerment directly, you are going to be limited. The model of success, which is looked to as a basis for improvement, is the Indigenous rights movement, and again, there is much more active participation. So we have, for instance, a voluntary fund, which actually pays for Indigenous representatives to come to meetings at Geneva or at New York. We have a permanent fund for Indigenous peoples, which actually has status under the Economic and Social Council to make presentations to that council, which increases its visibility. And indeed, we also have an expert mechanism, which means that the special representative on Indigenous peoples directly to the UN Human Rights. And all of that raising the significance of Indigenous claims at the UN, making them more likely to be heard. And the suggestion is that something similar should be done by minorities, and so far it has gone nowhere. And why? And again, that's problem, because minorities are seen to be more challenged solving for the existing states, because if you look at them in comparison to Indigenous peoples, these are smaller groups, tending to be geographically more limited, whereas if you look at the minorities, these are often groups that could possibly stand as alternative states. And again, that's a threat to all existing states, so it is not particularly popular. And I think I've already covered that point, and I think I'm only 5 minutes over. Not too bad. So I'm going to end then with my presentation and move on to what I hope and I'm sure will be interesting conversation with all of you.
This is Q&A time now. We'll take 2 questions and then I'll pass them on.
You've spoken about the union nations and you're interested in that. I wonder if you'd like to make a comment about the declaration and British mandates and how it's going to be. Professor, I've been listening to the theory of problem will obviously placing it into action and trying to get the concept of minority rights within the whole of the population of the world seems to me to be an almost impossible task. However, the starting point of only looking at minority rights is exclusive. I think one should look at human rights as well as human duties, and then we should compartmentalize it to majority rights and majority duties, as well as minority rights and minority duties, and get that into the heads of governments. That might be a better starting point. Would you like to comment on that?
Balfour Declaration and the question of is homicide definitely an interesting one. The Balfour Declaration itself, this is of course part of the problem, is not directly relevant for us to the nations minorities and guarantees because that system only really applies in Europe with one exception, which was Iraq and the one group that was recognized with the first. Other to that, it did not apply. And it did not apply, again, because, of course, decolonization was not on the agenda. Obviously, the mandate system is a separate system. This was set up in order to administer the colonies in the United States, and of course, as regards to Palestine, that is the Ottoman Empire, and Britain was the mandatory power. So in that context, of course, there was an understanding within the mandates that the mandatory powers should have recognition of the different communities that were there within the Palestine mandate and should be working with them. And again, clearly, there was a problem and there was not a lot of international oversight. So effectively, the mandatory powers had a lot of freedom to determine how they would govern within their mandated territories. There is an interesting follow-on, though. Through the League, as kind of part of its processes that it developed under the minority system, there was an international, in fact, civil service created around those treaties, and it developed a system where it would go to the different states that were subject to the minority guarantees and would actually meet with minorities and meet with governments, and in fact try to bargain between those two different groups. It's interesting because it actually anticipates the form of enforcement that we've had in Europe probably the end of the Cold War, which is very similar. So we have an expert mechanism linked to the General Convention Council, which does exactly that. And equally, we have a conflict prevention instrument under the LSE, which also does exactly that. One of the key actors who was involved in the World Recognition System Guarantee at the start was actually sent by the United Nations on a job at the United Nations in the Second World War. And this fellow, based on his experience and being able to negotiate, was sent to Jerusalem. And his job was to try and get an agreement, of course, between what we now consider to be Israel and Palestine for a negotiated settlement. It's linked, of course, in part to some of the UN decisions, actually the decision on the statute of the city of Jerusalem, for instance, which understood in the sense of power sharing agreement. So basically, plural as partners out there to negotiated two-state solution. It didn't work, and of course, all efforts since then have also failed. But what I think is historically interesting is the presumption of the only way forward in terms of the solution has never changed. It's always been right from that moment in 1948 onwards, an idea of a two-state solution, and it's never been achievable politically. So there's a long continuity around that. In terms of the question around human rights and minority rights, it's an interesting question. The way legally this is set up, minority rights post-45 are understood to be a part of the human rights system, so they are not understood to be separate from it. They're a part of it, and the human rights system as a whole has several parts to it. So there is the minorities part, there's the indigenous peoples part, there's the Afro-descendants part, there's the part dealing with questions having to do with race. There's a further emphasis on questions having to do with religion. So the way that the human rights system has been set up is not just to talk about the basic universal human rights that everywhere apply, but also the ways in which they can have bearing in specific situations, and an effort made to try and give them greater saliency to address specific problems. So in that sense, effectively what we have proposed is what is being done. There's a further complication in all of this, which plays out in politics, and that is a tendency of states to want to position human rights as an alternative to minority rights, which misunderstands the system, but plays in quite nicely politically, because they then, of course, turn around and say, well, when you have an individual human rights to freedom of expression, for instance, and the minority says, but I want my right to be able to express myself in my own language. And the state turns around and says, but you have a right to express yourself, you just do it in the majority language. So it's another form of attention. So yes, I agree. Obviously, human rights now are regarded as absolute sine qua non, but how we enforce them in particular circumstances requires a differentiated thinking to make sure that the way that they work is indeed dignifying all people and meeting all of their needs, including the ways in we are different. Of course, we are all alike, but we are all alike also in our differences, and that has to be recognized as well. There is a further presumption of the question, which I should also acknowledge. Clearly, the system that's been created has got a lot of room for growth. And yes, one could be very pessimistic on that, but at the same time, it exists, which is an achievement. If we look back at all of the times it exists, at least it gives us a language to be able to criticize and engage. And in fact, a lot has moved forward. So, I tend myself to try and be more of a glass half full rather than an empty person. Because unless we were, we would just give up and then we wouldn't get anywhere at all. So I think that understanding that this is a long journey that we're on, but we're at least started on the journey.
Thank you, really interesting. On this question of the journey, your reference to the statement in 1992 of minority rights, have we gone back to a kind of definition of minority rights? Are we returning to that conception? What was the difference between the 1992 statement and the conception of the new?
Refugees, are they a separate system, or what you be talking about others?
Thank you very much. Those interesting questions. The similarities between the League and the Minorities Declaration, I think at their core, fall along from that idea of recognition of particular characteristics. So they both have that element to them. And again, this is because there has never been any universal definition to what and who is a minority. So we fall back on adjectives almost by default. And you can see that within the UN Declaration, and its rights to persons belonging to national, ethnic, religious, and linguistic. And you can make a claim to have one of those characteristics. It's effective, you are a minority. The legal system operated similarly in the sense that it recognized specific commitments. But this is very specific because it was done in the context of particular either peace treaties or admissions to the League of Nations, where a particular state had to agree that within their territory, X, Y, and Z groups would be recognized. It was modeled on the first such treaty, which was, of course, the Treaty of Versailles, signed in Poland, and then that same model was applied. As a generalized principle, Jewish communities were recognized across all of them, but then there were other interesting differences. So, for instance, the treaty with the Kingdom of Yugoslavia also recognized Muslims and talked about the Muslim communities' rights to, for instance, cemeteries and to have separate religious arrangements, including recognition of Islamic practice, for instance, inheritance, whereas other states didn't have a minority population that was also did not have that. So they varied based on the actual demographics within states. There was an effort, interestingly, both in the League period and in the UN period to try and come up with a universal definition, and it failed. So at the League of Nations, we had under the International Court set up at the time something called the Silesia Schools case, where parents in Silesia were absolutely determined that their children were German and should be eligible for free German education, whereas the Polish states say no, they're not, they're Poles, and they should be going to school in Polish. And the court decided that it was ultimately not purely an objective decision whether you were a minority or not, but it would let the states decide on their own jurisdiction. So in fact, it just threw in the long grass. Equally, we had Special Rapporteur from Jackson-Preece and Italian who tried to come up with a definition in the 1970s, and he came up with an idea that minorities should have only implicitly a desire to continue to exist. And again, that can be either. So there were these efforts, and they all failed for the same reason. The other question was refugees, wasn't it? Refugees, again, have a separate legal status within the UN system. So who is and who is not a refugee is, of course, determined by the state's implementation of the United Nations Convention on Refugees. And all states are meant to look to the criteria within that convention, which is, of course, the idea that there is real threat of risk, and the threat of risk picks up particular groups that get recognized as part of that, likely to be part of that. And some of these are, of course, picking up those who are minorities for obvious reasons. But the legal rights as such are separate from minority rights and human rights, because it is a specific category of right intended to give safe haven through sanctuary levels within a state for those who are fleeing a reasonable risk of persecution within their countries of origin. I'm sure you've all realized this because it plays out on the news all the time. Each signatory state, of course, is responsible for setting up linguistic procedures in its own jurisdiction that will determine whether or not that stipulation within the UN Convention has been satisfied. All states have to establish the process and have to embrace the appeal, but each state interprets the cases differently. And this explains why you have some states agreeing that people coming from one particular place are a refugee, and other states, even though they are not. We see this today around refugees in Syria, where some countries have decided they're no longer a threat and should go back, and other countries haven't made that situation. So again, it's a sovereignty principle based strongly in this.
I am a minority person in Sweden. There are a lot of things being said. I just want to add that this is not taken into consideration very much, but it is growing, this idea is growing. Now, majority usually in some countries oppress their minorities, deny their rights. When it comes to donors, some donors do not look at the dynamics inside the problematic country. If they ignore the dynamics and do something, donate something, it aggravates the problem. So this system dynamics, now as the idea of system dynamics has been growing. I would like more and more people to look at that and learn more about it. System dynamics people are trying to introduce that in schools and universities, that idea. When I say system dynamics, for example, USA and EU and GIZ have been giving a lot of money over the last 50, 60 years to Sri Lanka. And look at it now, it is now IMF is trying splitting its head to sort out Sri Lanka's problem. It has gone to that level. So it is not only the majority of a country, the donors must be mindful of the situation there and not aggravate the situation.
I think some similar things that we would ask about human rights, where you say that the UN has limited ability to enforce minority rights and gender protection and promotion, where it then appears to the flip side of oppression and forced assimilation. Is that where the UN can step in? You take, for example, the region situation in China. So the flip side then becomes the greater human rights issue of actual oppression. And do you think with that the UN does then have its full ability to act?
Thank you. Both questions in effect speak again to the sovereignty movement. But before I get to that, I think we also use a very important word which invites me to say a few more things as well about dynamism and all of this. Dynamism, of course, is extremely important because these dynamics are constantly in motion. States obviously are changing, but so are minorities within them. And within minorities, we can also, of course, have problems with human rights. So the idea of current framing as an individual rights framework, so it's rights of persons belonging to minorities that may be exercised in community with others, is purposeful because it is intended not only to protect the group from the minority group, from the majority, from the state, but also to protect those inside the minority group who may well be different in different ways. And so, for instance, we have to be mindful of the dynamics of gender, for instance, inside minority groups, equally LGBTQ dynamics, equally age, equally disability. So again, the dynamism of thinking about this in a more intersectional way becomes really important. In terms of donors, yes, absolutely. And I think best practice is that we need to be mindful of the implications, particularly around conflict. There's a lot of course, in Sri Lanka. You have guidance on that through the United Nations in terms of its recommendations around development and development should be done. Equally, we have some very interesting work coming out of the World Bank, which has been particularly focused on the nexus between economic developments and grievances pushing forward into conflict. So all of the expert opinion has why doesn't it work in practice? Again, that is of course within the sovereignty and state interest, and donors who are also, of course, many of them working in conjunction with states to push particular foreign policy objectives, which might give saliency to wishing to fund a particular state irrespective, because that state plays a role in security of foreign policy objectives of another country where the donors are based. And again, the role of the United States, for instance, and Sri Lanka, having that kind of an effect. So it is very difficult to avoid that, particularly when it is up to the sovereignty of each state to determine its own foreign policy and the aid that would come through that. So again, those ambiguities and contradictions are ones that we see all over the place when we're looking at issues of this kind. The question of the Uyghurs, fascinating question. It again comes up the problem of sovereignty, because if you look back at the track record on cases where there has been action versus there has not been action, and ultimately the real enforcement of all of this, and then of course would be strong sanction, possibly up to and including some kind of intervention. In order to do that, we need, of course, to have the support of the United Nations Security Council. China has a veto power on the United Nations Security Council. We will never ever have anything to do with the Uyghurs passed by the United Nations. Equally, Myanmar will never have that, because China will veto that. So what we then see is, in effect, in certain cases where you either have a great power, you don't have that great power, forward, and you don't have a great power, prepared to obstruct it. And then something can happen. But unless you have that happy coincidence, effectively then nothing happens.
I've got a question myself. So when you suggested you're going to speak about international protection of minorities, immediately I thought indigenous people somehow forgot that other minority. That's probably because most minorities and African descendants are able to integrate into the one system. The indigenous probably find it more difficult, so we almost have a two-state situation. So would you reflect on that? The other question that arises all the time is the biggest problem is sovereignty, and governance. That is the biggest problem of all times. Would you comment on that, please?
Well, yes, because we live in a state system which is based on the principle of sovereignty, territorially defined. And as long as we continue to base such a system, then sovereignty, of course, is going to be the key basis for action, or of course for inaction. This is recognized with the course of the doctrine of responsibility text, which is trying to redefine sovereignty in such a way that those who have sovereignty should be using it in a manner which is going to be respectful of human rights, including, of course, minority rights. Again, it's great as a theory. It is an important development, but clearly it doesn't take us to the reality of the world where all sovereigns are fully respecting human rights and minority rights, and are acting in a way that we fulfilling the kind of classic liberal democracy principles that would then put us in a very different position. Instead, by the way, in this position, we must be scared. There are always going to be controversies to do belonging and non-belonging, and even in that world, we need so many ideas of rights to guide us through the controversies and contradictions. Again, we can think of controversies that we have in the United States that are robust, democracy, there are all kinds of them. I think even, of course, the one that we're in right now, so it is a movement, but clearly, if we reach that point, the general level of rights we would expect would be better, but not perfect. The indigenous people who asked about that, it's an interesting one. In some ways, I think I would contradict you and say because the rights are better, there's better participation. Indigenous people now are actually in a pretty good position. In North America, for sure, yeah, absolutely. If you compare indigenous people's rights to Roma, you see a really stark difference. The Roma are far more vulnerable. And again, the vulnerability follows on from the fact that we do not have as many mechanisms through which they can represent themselves and engage in dialogue.
Couple of last questions.
Thanks very much. I'm sort of troubled by definitions. I struggle with my minorities
thoughts about that. What about majority, the definition of majority? Because one body can base the state of majority. Of course, there are states, like South Africa, where the minority is in power and persecuted the majority. So I guess and the dynamics of the situation may change, and the population changes may alter the situation. So how do we define majority against minority? In the end, we find it's going to helpful actually.
Yes, and I was wondering that on the positive side, perhaps, to what extent do you feel that the driving movement might act as a template or other conflicts?
I'm afraid the definitional questions sit like Alice in Wonderland through the rookie bus. There is no agreed definition for majority either, by the way, isn't that delightful? In fact, the efforts to try and define a minority also have to think about what the majority would be. And for instance, the Professor who I already mentioned, made the point that we couldn't think of majorities necessarily in numeric terms, because of course that would mean, writing numerics, etc., that the majority in numeric terms, African population of South Africa would constitute a minority, but the then white Afrikaner ruling numerically minority would get minority rights, completely contradictory to the logic that we want. So the way these are understood, as many definitions, is that the focal point should be all around who owns the state and who controls the state. In other words, who has power, who is exercising sovereignty. And around that, then, we can think of issues having to do with minorities. So it's context dependent. And if you have ownership of the state, then clearly you cannot follow this minority because you are fully empowered in that way. Whereas if you do not have ownership, then you might begin to use it for different decisions. The Northern Ireland Agreement, it is obviously a success case. There is a whole area of scholarship and indeed an activity around something called complex power sharing. Colin Bond, the LSE, we were here, an expert in all of this, which suggests that in order to resolve self-determination disputes, of course, Northern Ireland was, ideally you need to have complex power sharing between the groups. You need to be able to negotiate with in which each of these groups will recognize one another and will agree arrangements or governance through which, of course, there is that sharing power. That tends to work best where you also have outside powers who are able to act as guarantors for that arrangement. And of course, in Ireland, the big guarantor, the outside guarantor, is the United States, that able, therefore, to bring forward negotiations. We also, of course, have the happy coming together of the government of the Irish Republic and the government of the United Kingdom, who were equally fully supportive of a negotiated settlement. So everything was rolled up very nicely, which is why it stands as a success story, and again tells us how the best case scenario is to unfold. Getting it to happen in practice, of course, is an awful lot more problematic. And again, I think salient to the example is the moment where you have to reach the point that there is willingness on the inside to negotiate. In other words, there is a readiness to lay down violent arms as a way to succeed politically. And we did get that, of course, as part of the movement to the Good Friday Agreement. Unless you have that, and some have that, the sorts of negotiated settlements also can be very difficult to make happen.
The last question, last two questions, and then we'll go on that copy.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really interesting. I'm sorry I was talking, but I was at COP, I guess COP 27, and increasingly we see more indigenous populations being visible and having a voice. Not that I'm saying we get to listen to at all, but they do have things to say around climate change. Do they obviously to have a role in things like climate change a positive role that governments recognise and want to promote or
Yeah, a complication. We have seen a lot of problems around the world with things like religious fundamentalism, whether it be Christian fundamentalism or Muslim fundamentalism or whatever else. Now, how do we find the rights of that section of the population that adheres to those strict fundamentalist ideals?
The climate change conversation and indigenousness is a fascinating area. And again, it's another area actually where indigenous peoples have a whole lot of influence. So in fact, through the UN, through the various parts of the UN that I just talked you through, climate change is a key issue of concern. And therefore an area through which indigenous peoples are making their voices heard, because of course they, in their traditional occupations, they will be disproportionately affected by climate change. Climate change as well varies for minorities for similar reasons. Again, it may impact traditional occupations of minorities, unfortunately, also because minorities often are located in areas which are either poor areas, less infrastructure invested within them, or more peripheral to the center of power of the state. They may well too disproportionately be affected by extreme weather events and deforestation, the desertification, and so on. So all of those issues become increasingly important. So as well, the UN Special Rapporteur for Minorities, for instance, in his last reports, has actually highlighted climate change as a significant issue area that needs also to be addressed in the context of minority rights. So definitely both of those fronts is a key issue. In terms of religious fundamentalism, well, of course, the United Nations backed and regionally backed human rights guarantees give you the right to freedom of religion. And freedom of religion that you have a right to is in that sense at your discretion, meaning that there is full respect for the ways in which you choose to exercise that right in terms of being a member of a more fundamentalist version of faith. The point where this becomes controversial, of course, is the point where we talk about conflict scenarios. So what would not be consistent with the human rights and minority rights approach would be an individual or a group wishing to justify infringing the rights of another individual or group based on their religious presumptions that could be going too far. And again, the normal expectations around respect for human security of all worlds creatures are clearly at an absolute extreme. It would not be possible to justify, for instance, an act of terrorism on the basis of equivalent religious conviction. And again, that would be a fundamental limitation of the right. But within those extremes, there is an awful lot of latitude, and that is recognized as core to understanding what the right to religion are properly to examine. So you're free to worship whatever that is best for you. And equally, if you're as a choice to wear particular religious forms of clothing or to have particular dietary restrictions, again, those choices are often to be cited as part of the human rights.
Thank you very much. It's been coffee next door, please. Thank you for coming here. Thanks.
Before I forget, I don't want to touch it. Those two bags. I've got all my lectures on there as well. Oh, no. Do you need help? This one? Thank you.
And that.
Thank you.
Actually, it is now meaningless.